going to officially get started. So on the official beginning, I am going to start the recording. So everybody, for your announcement. So hi, everybody. It's so nice to see you for our high school and college level program class today on all about the Constitutional Convention. It is Constitution Week, and we are so excited to be here today. So today's class will be live streamed, and as you just heard, it's also recorded. So students who want to watch it again, or other students who have missed it, can find this on our YouTube channel or on our past recorded session. Wow. My name is Kerry Sautner. I'm from the National Constitution Center, and today, one of our top scholars, Tom Donnelly. Tom, you want to do your own intro?
Sure. Hi, I'm Tom Donnelly. I'm a senior fellow for Constitutional Studies at the National Constitution Center. Couldn't be more excited to be with you today and to discuss the Constitutional Convention in honor of Constitution Week and Constitution Day tomorrow. So can't wait.
I know, such a fun week. Now where our class is going to be 30 minutes long. Please feel free to open up that chat box. I'm going to be asking you questions as we go through. Put in questions that you have there. We'll stay on the topic of the Constitutional Convention. But if you find the chat a little distracting, it's okay. You can close the chat box. I will say the questions out loud to you every single time. And you can also use the Q&A box. Great place to send questions, send ideas, anything you want, because Tom and I love to chat with you during these programs. So Tom, we have a lot to go over, and I have a big list of things that I need you to answer on this topic. Here's some big ideas around the Constitutional Convention. Why did the founding generation decide the rights of the Constitution? How did the United States Constitution differ from the Articles of Confederation? And on a side note, what the heck are the Articles of Confederation? And then what are some of the main compromises reached by the delegates at the Constitutional Convention? So we're going to go through all of these, but could you start us off with laying a foundation of, tell us where we are, almost like in our history timeline. When did the Constitution, when was it written? What did they do at the Constitutional Convention? What brought them to the Constitutional Convention? And then what are some of the big compromises? And then we'll get to the compromises. But can you give us like almost like the foundational level of time, place, what, when, where, and how we got to the Constitutional Convention? That would be really helpful.
Absolutely. So let's set the stage. First, I'll begin with some, just some basic facts about the convention itself, and then we'll walk the path of those years leading up to the convention and sort of explain why is it that the delegates were meeting in Philadelphia to begin with. So just some fun facts about the convention. So the convention, the Constitution is drafted in secret at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and the convention runs from May of 1787 through September 17th, 1787. And so the Constitution is completed in roughly 100 working days, which is really, considering how much the delegates disagreed and how difficult the task was, a really extraordinary achievement. So the convention meets in the Pennsylvania State House, now, which you see the picture right there, which is now known as Independence Hall. What's really cool about the Constitution Center, one of the many things, is as we commute and get to walk into the Constitution Center, we can look right across a field and we see Independence Hall right there. And it's just such an inspiring way to go to work every day. A couple of other things about the convention that's worth knowing. On the final day of the convention, we actually have 3 delegates that refuse to sign the Constitution. So these delegates, George Mason, Elbridge Gerry, Edmund Randolph, decide not to sign the Constitution for reasons we'll get into later. Others, end up leaving the convention unhappy with the way the Constitution was going. So key delegates like Luther Martin of Maryland were concerned about what was actually happening at the convention itself. The delegates themselves are selected by their states, and while in the convention, the delegates vote by state. And so that's how political power is structured within the convention. It's by these delegations of states sent there by their states. The average age of the delegates in the room, 42. Most were lawyers, and the convention very quickly, one of its first acts, they elect George Washington as president of the convention. So he's there, he's presiding over everything, doesn't really say very much, but his very presence lends dignity to the convention and really lets everyone know something serious is happening at the convention. At the same time, there are some key figures that are not at the convention. So who's not there? Well, Thomas Jefferson's in France. John Adams is in England. John Hancock's the governor of Massachusetts. A key figure like Virginia's Patrick Henry is really skeptical about a new convention, really fearful of a strong national government, and chooses not to attend the convention. So you also have delegates that are so critical of the very project of a stronger national government, they decide not to show up. So in the end, the Constitution, again, it's completed by the delegates in the room September 17th, ends up being ratified June 21st, 1788, and the first Congress begins on March 4th, 1789. And so those are the basic facts, but why is it that they end up in that room in Philadelphia? So the thing to keep in mind is we already have a framework, we already have a national government that we're being governed by at that particular point in time. It's called the Articles of Confederation. So what's the one thing you really need to know about the Articles of Confederation? Well, it's a very weak central government. As Kerry has there, it's a league of friendship. So in a way, the Articles of Confederation, which governs us through the Revolutionary War and all the way up to the new Constitution, it's more like a United Nations than it is a United States of America. So you have 13 independent states, independent governments. And just to put you in the frame of mind of people in America at that time, this is really exciting stuff. These 13 state governments are opportunities to create new governments out of whole cloth, really write separate constitutions for each of these, what could be separate independent nations. And so for many Americans, the action was really happening at the state level, and the national government was either a distraction or in many cases, something to be afraid of. And so the Articles of Confederation end up being quite weak. So how is it, what are some of the powers that it lacks? So, the Articles of Confederation doesn't have the power to tax. It doesn't have the power to regulate commerce between the states. It doesn't have the power to raise armies. And so here, importantly, so it has all of it. So like, why might you create a government like this? Why does this make sense as a national framework at the founding? Well, remember what we just did, or what we were actually doing while the Articles is in place. We're fighting a revolution against a strong central government that we thought was distant and abusive. And so what we tried to do is we wanted to craft new governments at the state level that were closest to the people, these governments having a great deal of power. But at the same time, when creating the Articles, we wanted to create a weaker framework of government. We did not want the national government to abolish the states, to shape policy in all of these important ways. And we were skeptical of that sort of national power. And so we create a national government that lacks all of these powers. Furthermore, we craft a national government that requires unanimity to amend it. And this becomes a really big problem because even those who are skeptical of national power come to become critical of the Articles of Confederation and some of these flaws, and would have liked to have amended the Articles of Confederation in certain ways, but required unanimity, which anyone who's tried to make a big decision based on unanimity, whether in your household, as you said in our first session, Kerry, all the way up to at work, it's virtually impossible. And so we end up with a government that's stuck in place. And from many people's perspectives, from a range of perspectives about what the national government should look like, one, inadequate to the task of really creating and governing a great nation. And so that's a bit about the Articles, Kerry. I don't know if there's anything to follow up on there or where we should go.
Yeah, so let me unpack it. Yeah, 100% agreement on anything is virtually impossible for humans. So the fact that they set that up with the Articles of Confederation, kind of blows my mind, but it really explains that they were acting as separate entities. And so if they think of themselves almost like, the European Union, Europe before the European Union, or you said the United Nations, I thought that was a great example of how different they were. But when I kind of want to ask this to the chat room too, is what do you think were some of the issues between the states? So we have this issue overall as one whole country, and the fact that we have issues with Britain, we have issues with Portugal and Spain. France is dealing with their own issues going on in France right now, but we have other major superpowers coming out at us, and then we're bickering among the states. So Alyssa shared that each state had its own currency and enacted individual group state trade agreements and taxes. I'm like, gosh, you're really good, Alyssa.
Mm-hmm.
But you are spot on right. And look at the difference. I sometimes just say, use your eyes. Look at the difference between Rhode Island and man, was Virginia big back then? Really big. So Tom, can you kind of unpack that? How were we bickering amongst each other? We weren't acting we weren't even maybe acting like friends at times.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if you looking at this from the perspective of a George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. So these are voices during this period before the Constitution that are all in support of a stronger national government and are really concerned about exactly what Kerry's talking about here, which are conflicts between the states and the vulnerabilities this might provide with European powers looking at us, expecting us to implode. And so from a nationalist perspective, the divisions of the states were problematic from two perspectives. One is, what if in the end we really do just become Europe? And so, and then really, what is the destiny of America? It's what the destiny of Europe was, which was wars between the states, competition between the states, a lack of peace, and obviously a lack of union. From the perspective of looking at these powers in the outside world, many of whom were basically laughing at us. We signed a peace treaty with the British. They still have their outposts out west. And because the national government can't actually raise an army, tax, can't do any of these things, we have the British just waiting there, looming on the horizon. And the concern there is that, we can't really engage in a foreign policy. And we might have foreign powers pit us against one another and result in foreign domination of America. So there's those concerns. For the national government itself, there's just the general idea of Congress struggling. It had no money. It didn't have the power to tax. So it's struggling just to fund the national government. Frankly, from Washington's perspective, it's struggling to pay his soldiers. And, and so you have disgruntled soldiers who are concerned about not receiving pay, not receiving pensions. And the national government really requiring, how is it funded? The national government has to say, states, please give us money, which you could really imagine how well that went. With states not too eager, they themselves dealing with debt, not too eager to take on the responsibilities of the national government. The last part, Kerry, is also, you have different states, you have the idea of each of them having different currency. You have each of them, especially the large states against the small states, taxing their businesses. And so there's no free trade in the United States. We have different states putting up their own trade barriers, protecting their own businesses, and trying to guard against competition from other states, which in the grand scheme of things ends up cratering the American economy. And so for the average American, especially those living on the frontier, what are they facing? Well, they're facing high land taxes. So they're having their land taxed. They have no money. They have a lot of debt. And then you have state governments threatening and in fact taking away their farms, throwing them in debtors' prisons. And so you even just have the national government, which is very weak, but you have this a tension between the state government and the citizens of the states, wondering if these state governments are actually going to hear the voice of the American people. And then reverberating out from that, you have concerns among some of the nationalists that if those state governments are too responsive to the people on the frontier, you might have things like debtors' relief laws. So in the end, it might become harder and harder to borrow money. And so all of these problems that require a certain amount of coordination, you literally can't do that with the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah, and the group is really has this. So Mike shared territorial disputes, currency problems. Each state has its own military to protect its own interests. I think that's really essential, seeing them as their own interests. And then the double taxing, nice one. You guys really know your stuff. Jack, talking about how some colonial charters said they had the land all the way to the west. Mm-hmm. And then Larissa really wraps it up nicely, puts two big buckets on this. And we're going to get to this and where we see it in the United States Constitution on September 17th, where we see it come out. Commerce and slavery, two big ideas and two big issues. And as we get through this, we kind of get, and Tom, would you call this next kind of moment like the tipping point before the Constitutional Convention? Would you call Shay's Rebellion kind of that moment in American history where it was almost like a make or break time?
Yeah, I think it did spur enough additional people. There were always some nationalists, but it sort of spurred more and more people to say something has to give. And so here's Shay's Rebellion, which again, I love that picture, Kerry. So what is Shay's Rebellion? So it's late 1786. We see the great economic uncertainty and an economic downturn throughout the United States, and we're in Western Massachusetts. And the people of Western Massachusetts, the farmers there, are dealing with all of the problems I just spoke about: high taxes, high debt, no way to pay for that debt. And they're looking at the government in Boston and saying, you are not hearing our concerns. You are not pursuing policies that help us. It's an impossible situation for us. Now, who's Daniel Shays? Well, he's a 39-year-old veteran of the Revolutionary War. He fought at Lexington. He fought at Bunker Hill. And he's very much thinking, I spilled my blood. I lost some of my friends in the revolution. For what? For what? We are suffering here out west, and our own state government will not hear our voice. And who were Shay's Rebellion being a gathering of armed people led by Shays out in Western Massachusetts, many of them farmers. Who are those farmers? A lot of them are ex-soldiers. And what they want debt relief. They want the state government to hear them. And so they're marching all out in Western Massachusetts. They're seizing control of court buildings to try to keep the courts and the state government from seizing their farms. They're closing down debtors' prisons. And they're even looking to commandeer arms from Springfield, Massachusetts, because what they want to do is they want to arm themselves even more. They want to have more people behind them, and they want to march on Boston and say, state government, you must hear us. And so what happens from there? Well, under the Articles of Confederation, the national government could do really nothing, because the national government doesn't have the power to force the states to send troops. And so here, they could sort of request it, but they can't raise an army to address this. And so who puts down Shay's rebellion but a Massachusetts militia? And so for Washington, for Madison, for Hamilton, for their allies who want a stronger national government, this ends up being, really the most concrete example of why that's necessary. Because they look at Shay's rebellion and they don't see just one minor flashpoint. They see this could be the future. And if this is the future, there are two really bad things about that. One is the violence itself and a national government not able to provide just basic safety to their people. The flip side, though, being that the Articles of Confederation didn't have the power to address the concerns that these Americans had. And so for someone like Washington, who again, he himself had served as head of the military under the Articles of Confederation, he remembers when he wasn't getting funding from the national government. He remembers when his soldiers weren't being paid. He has seen the threats of mutiny from his own soldiers, who were loyal Americans who just wanted a good life in America. And so they were also sensitive to the degree to which the Articles couldn't address these policy concerns. And so what do? They say, we need a new convention. We need to either, for some of them, maybe revise the Articles of Confederation. For some of them, maybe we need a new government. And so they turned to the Confederation Congress, who on February 21st, 1787, agreed to call a convention of state delegates in Philadelphia to quote, for the quote, sole and express purpose of revising the Articles. But as we know, certain delegates had different ideas about what was going to happen at that convention.
Which is always my favorite. The question of, did they walk in thinking they were going to fix it? Or did they totally walk in saying, oh no, we're going to take the governing document and we're going to have a full revolution without any bloodshed and throw it out? At a side note, we had a group, right after the Arab Spring, we had a group of constitutional writers from the region of the Arab Spring come to the National Constitution Center, walk into our Signers Hall, and ask how the men in Signers Hall were transparent to the public during the Constitutional Convention. And it was very hard, but I did chuckle just a little. So, Tom, can you tell them why I laughed? Was it transparent? Was it an open dialogue? Were people watching?
It was not. The proceedings were in secret. In fact, they shut the windows down. They locked the door. It was hot and smelly and uncomfortable, but they didn't want people to be able to hear what was happening inside.
Yeah, summer, Philadelphia, windows closed. And we had some yellow fever issues going on in Philly at that time, but we also had a really bad black fly epidemic that summer. Oh, yeah. And to not interrupt the delegates, they put down straw and manure around the cobblestone and Belgium box around Independence Hall so the carriages weren't so noisy. So yeah, it was fragrant. But even with all that,
very gross, I agree.
I'm sorry, I love to tell the gross part of history too. Even with all that, from May to September, they write out the structural constitution. So I want to get to the compromises, because I think that's really the part of the Constitution that we all still need to understand and say, why did they do that? Comes out with the compromises. But can you do a quick story walk through the structural constitution?
Sure, absolutely. So what's the Constitution? Well, we're going to walk through the original Constitution is a preamble and 7 articles. So the preamble is the famous words, "We the people," where we're expressing that core American commitment to popular sovereignty. My beloved James Wilson is very much, at the heart of that particular part of the Constitution, some of our most inspiring words. So after the preamble, we set out our principle of we the people and some of the purposes of the government. And then in Articles 1, 2, and 3, we establish the different branches of government. And so this is where we begin to see the separation of powers, with Article 1 giving us the legislative branch, which is Congress. Congress is going to make the law. Article 2 laying out the executive branch led by a single president responsible for enforcing the laws. And Article 3 outlines the judicial branch with the Supreme Court as the nation's highest court, and it has the duty to interpret the laws. And so right here, we see the structure 1, 2, and 3. If we look at the rest of the Constitution, you're dealing with a bunch of other issues that are left outside of that. So Article 4 is addressing the relationship between the states and their citizens, the admission of new states, how we're going to govern federal territories. Again, so we have this huge expanse in the West. How are we going to govern it? Article 5 sets out a process for amending the Constitution. We're not going to have unanimity to amend it this time as with the Articles. We're going to make the amendment process still difficult, but easier than that. Article 6 establishes the supremacy of national law over state law, and Article 7 sets out the process for ratifying the Constitution. It's going to require the approval of 9 states, and this is that key point, Kerry, where the delegates may be coming to the convention. They may even decide to go past what the mandate was by Congress and write a new government, but it's only a proposal, and it's only through the ratification by the American people in the various states that really bring it to life. That's the core of popular sovereignty.
So it's amazing, even though hot, sweaty, smelly, difficult, and a lot of debate, they still lay out this amazing structure, or what I like to refer to as the instruction manual or the blueprints of American democracy, and kind of walk you through it. But there was a lot of compromise, and some compromise that we may think was brilliant, and some people have said like a miracle in Philadelphia, but also some compromises that other historians have referred to as the original sin of the United States. So let's kind of like dive. I know there are really kind of either sides of it, but we have to look at the whole history, but let's dive into that. So here's the 4 big ones. Tom, can you walk us through the Connecticut Compromise, Electoral College, 3/5, and the Slave Trade Clause?
Absolutely. And so, Kerry, for the first 2 bullets, I'll try to do that in relatively less time so we can really devote sufficient time. There's never sufficient time, but relatively more time to the compromises over slavery, which are the last 2. So we just laid out the structural constitution. What's the big idea to keep in mind about the convention, about this original constitution? Well, it's that the delegates came to Philadelphia to create a new government, and they were looking to create one that was stronger than the weak Articles of Confederation, but also one of limited powers. And so they were looking to strike a balance between a government that worked, but also the one that wasn't going to abuse its power and threaten our liberties. And so it's really hard to figure out how to do that. And here are some of the key compromises that they had to hammer out. So the first bullet there is the Connecticut or Great Compromise, and this has to do with the structure of Congress. And so this opens up a debate between large states and small states, and how we're going to determine the rules of representation in Congress. So what are the 2 sides? Well, for the large states, they want to see Congress organized around the principle of population. So if you're a bigger state, you get more representatives. And so this is, you see here, James Madison on the left, James Wilson on the right. And they laid out, and Madison laid out in the Virginia plan, which really framed the debate here, a vision of 2 houses of Congress, but both of them would be selected by the size of population. And so it's the principle of population, that's the large states. Now the small states, and needless to say, they don't like this idea. They're afraid of being, so like, again, the Articles of Confederation organized around equal state representation, every state gets a vote. They're not eager to enter into a new constitution where they might get swamped by the large states, where they may have very few representatives in Congress, and states like Virginia and Pennsylvania, James Madison and James Wilson states, would have quite a few. So the small states come in, and this is, someone at the beginning had talked about New Jersey. Well, this is the New Jersey plan, William Patterson being the main mastermind behind it. And so really what the argument right there is that we should stick, when we get to the state legislature, we may give the state legislature more power than the Articles of Confederation, but we need to stick to equal representation of the states. So small states want equal representation, every state having the same number of votes in the legislature, and the large states want representation by population, with larger states receiving more. What happens? Well, we broker the Connecticut or Great Compromise, called the Connecticut Compromise because of Connecticut's Roger Sherman, who brokers this compromise. That's Roger Sherman on the left, and that's Oliver Ellsworth, also from Connecticut, on the right. I can't resist giving a little description here of Roger Sherman. This is a letter to Massachusetts Delegate Rufus King warning Rufus about dealing with Roger Sherman. This is what the letter says. Describes Sherman was, quote, cunning as the devil, and if you attack him, you ought to know him well. He is not easily managed, but if he suspects you are trying to take him in, you may as well catch an eel by the tail. And so Roger Sherman, another of these, by many people, forgotten founders, very active in the debates at the convention and critical to this compromise. What's the compromise? Well, it's what we end up with in Article 1 of the Constitution, where the US House of Representatives follows the Virginia plan and is organized around state population, with larger states receiving more representatives, and the Senate being organized around the New Jersey plan's principle of equal representation. So every state getting 2 senators. And so that's a compromise. And by saying compromise, I don't mean to suggest that everyone just got around together and we're like, oh, this is a great idea, and we all vote for it. It was bitterly contested. It went down to a single vote. James Madison and James Wilson were devastated by losing the battle over apportionment of the Senate. They didn't like the equal representation of the states. And so, sometimes compromises are just battles, and one, you find a middle position, but there's still people who come away disappointed. That was certainly true of Wilson and Madison. So that's the Connecticut Compromise, Kerry.
I'm going to do a shout out to Hal and Jane in the chat, because they both answered appropriately that Rhode Island was so upset of the fact that they might lose their equal representation, and meaning equal voice and vote, that they did not even show up to the convention. So they were worried that it wasn't just going to be removal of the articles, but a change in the system. One real quick question as we go kind of loop around back to that is, one of our students asked, how do you think the Articles of Confederation would have been amended to have a stronger national government while maintaining more states' rights? And I guess the question really quickly, Tom, was, do you think it could have?
I think it would only have been amended if you could have actually gotten Rhode Island to participate in the Articles of Confederation, because they weren't even active in the Articles, let alone the Constitutional Convention. And so as long as there's unanimity, it's hard. Again, you had almost all of this. I think it was 12 of 13 states wanted to give the Confederation Congress some powers of taxation and some of these things we're talking about, but they would always run into the problem of the amendment rules. But I think it would be something like what William Patterson's calling for. Go back and look at the New Jersey plan. He's open to some additional powers on taxing, on commerce, and so you can imagine, something like that. It's something like the New Jersey plan really being what people might have coalesced around. Great question.
Okay, and I know this is a magic 8 ball. We're like taking guesses about what.
It's my favorite kind. There's no wrong answer.
Very fun. Okay, so Electoral College, go for it. And
Electoral College here in like 45 seconds, if I can, if that's possible. So the Electoral College is how we select a president. The number of electors being linked to the number of representatives of Congress that your state has. So if you have 2 members of the House, 2 members of the Senate, you have 4 electors in the Electoral College. In the end, whoever wins a majority of the Electoral College becomes president, whether or not they won the national popular vote. If there's no majority in the Electoral College, it then goes to the House of Representatives, and the House votes by state. This happened in 1824, and that's how we wound up with John Quincy Adams as president. So that's the structure. How did we end up with this structure? Well, it ends up as a compromise between really 2 big camps. There's a lot of different proposals, but we will boil it down to this. There are people like James Wilson, Gouverneur Morris, eventually James Madison, who support the direct popular election of the president. And so here they want a national popular vote. Whoever gets the most votes wins. And so you have that on one side. On the other side, you have many, many delegates who support the congressional election of president. And with the idea that Congress is the most knowledgeable of the members of our community, and that therefore they would be in the best position to judge who should be president. The Electoral College ends up as a compromise that each of those sides can live with. For James Wilson and those who supported the direct popular vote, they see the Electoral College as the best option they can get at the founding. The idea being that we left the decision of how to select the electors to the states, and that over time that process would become more democratic. And Wilson proved right, because that's basically what we see now, with the electors determined by the popular votes in the states. On the other side, for those who support a congressional election, they looked at the Electoral College and thought, after George Washington, presidential candidates are not going to be able to get a majority in the Electoral College. And so as a result, these elections are going to go to the House of Representatives. And so we'll get congressional election by other means. That prediction proved wrong, but that explains the compromise. So that's the Electoral College. Shall we move on to sort of the saddest part of the convention, really?
Yeah, and I think it's really important, because when we study American history, we have a tendency to either, to see one side or the other. And I think it's Jill Lepore and Danielle Allen, who are 2 amazing historians and professors, and they talk about it's either the glory or the gore. Like, glory, everything's perfect or everything's a bloody battle. And that the way we should really be studying our American history is looking at the whole story. And that means the hard history sometimes too. So this is the part that historians talk about the original sin of the Constitution. So 3/5 Compromise, and the Slave Trade Clause.
Sure. And so just to put the facts on the table, if we're looking at the delegates to the convention, 25 of 55 held enslaved people. And so for those delegates, slavery ends up being key to their personal wealth, and in their states, often a key to the state economy. And so that's sort of the interest of the slaveholders. They have a lot of political power in the convention. Broadly speaking, where does the convention come around on this? Well, for those who are critics of slavery, they ensure that the Constitution, one, doesn't mention the word slave, but also, two, doesn't provide for what was called at the time the right to property in man. And so here, this would be, additional protections to the constitutional property of slavery written into the Constitution itself. They make sure that that doesn't end up in there. However, the slaveholding delegates end up securing a range of structural compromises that protect the interests of slavery through the structure of the Constitution itself. And so we're going to discuss two of those right here: the 3/5 Compromise and what's known as the Slave Trade Clause. Beginning with the 3/5 Compromise, this is arguably the most important of these compromises. So as we discussed just a couple minutes ago, the U.S. House of Representatives draws up its districts based on population, and this raises the question of what do we do with enslaved persons for purposes of drawing up these districts? Do we count them as as full people? Do we not count them as at all? And so we have a battle here between slaveholding delegates and critics of slavery, with the slaveholding delegates saying count our enslaved persons as 5/5 as a full person for purposes of congressional representation. This would give them more political power in the House of Representatives, whereas the critics of slavery say don't count them at all. And here's just an amazing quote from Gouverneur Morris, who's, again, one of the strongest critics of slavery at the convention. He describes in these debates over the 3/5 Compromise, slavery as a, quote, nefarious institution, the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. And Morris attacks the 3/5 Clause for giving, quote, the inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina who goes to the coast of Africa and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondages. It says they shall have more votes in a government instituted for the protection of the right of mankind than the citizen of Pennsylvania or New Jersey who views with a laudable horror so nefarious a practice. And Gouverneur Morris really gets, goes directly at the slaveholding delegates and says, if in the end an enslaved person is a man, then make him a citizen and allow him to vote. If an enslaved person is merely property, then why should we provide additional representation based on enslaved people as property? If we don't also, give me, I'm from Pennsylvania, more congressional representation because the houses in Philadelphia are worth a lot, or all of these other forms of property that that the North holds more than the South. And so we have this battle going on there. And so where do we come out with how do we get the 3/5 Compromise? Well, again, it's Connecticut's Roger Sherman brokering a compromise, rejecting both the 5/5 of the slaveholding delegates, the 0/5 of the critics of slavery, and coming up with 3/5 of enslaved people counting as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional representation. And this has a huge impact over time. So, the 3/5 Clause ends up boosting the political power of the slaveholding states in Congress by giving a 3/5 boost to based on the enslaved people in those states within the House of Representatives. This then, refracts into the Electoral College, the number of electors being determined by the members of Congress, so increasing the political power of the slaveholding states in the Electoral College. And even the Supreme Court ends up being appointed by the president. And so as you magnify the powers of these slaveholding states in the Electoral College, you have more pro-slavery presidents, which shape the sorts of justices that end up on the Supreme Court. And so, from the perspective of the North and even critics of slavery, they go along with this compromise because they fear that the slaveholding states are simply going to leave the convention and the entire project will fail. But it's a genuine compromise.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to understand how this clause built in slavery into the Constitution and gave those Southern states more power across the entire government. Colin has a great question in here, but I'm going to let you, and so I'm going to, Colin, your great question is coming next, because Tom, I do want you to kind of walk us through the Slave Trade Clause, and then Colin's question is connected to 3/5, but also to ratification, and which is next week's theme, but I would love to end with Colin's question.
Okay, that's perfect. So yes, the final the final compromise is over the debate over the international slave trade. And if we're thinking about 1787, it's important to note that it's not just Northerners and critics of slavery who are critics of the brutal international slave trade. It's even many slaveholders themselves, particularly those from the Upper South in Virginia. So someone like George Mason, who had enslaved people, was still critical of the international slave trade. And so there's a battle in the convention over whether Congress was going to have the power to abolish the importation of enslaved people. Initially, the drafts of the Constitution, the convention agrees to not grant Congress this power. So it says, no, Congress does not have this power. It then goes in the opposite direction and says in 1800, Congress can begin banning the international slave trade. And then the Deep South, so people from Georgia, the delegates from Georgia, South Carolina, push back and say, that's not good enough. We're going to leave the convention. And so the delegates set the date at 1808. So beginning in 1808, Congress has the power to ban the international slave trade, but not before. So when 1808 comes, Congress abolishes the international slave trade at that moment. However, in those intervening years, you have 200,000 new enslaved people coming from Africa and being enslaved in the United States, which is only, it's only 50,000 less than we had in all of our history to that point. So it's a massive number of people being brought to this country. And even once you abolish the international slave trade, there are enough enslaved people in the United States that you then have an internal slave trade happening in between the states. And so, whereas, delegates to the convention predicted that slavery might die out in a generation or two, Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut said slavery in time will not be a speck in our country. That tragically, that prediction proved to be incorrect.
Yeah, we were talking to earlier's class, and I'll ask you guys as well, what was one of the reasons that slavery doesn't do what they think it's going to do and begin to die out, but then become more ingrained into the economy and into the government of the Constitution? Very good, Teddy. Nice answer. Got it.
There we go, Teddy.
Man, that was quick.
Very.
I know, I couldn't even get it out. It was awesome. So Colin's question, and it's a great question about ratification and the connection between the structural Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Didn't some states ratify only upon the promise of a Bill of Rights, and which does contain the protection of their property, can't be taken without due process of law, and weren't enslaved people seen as property at the time?
That is a great question, and you're already previewing, battles over what due process and what property meant, all from the adoption moment all the way up until the Civil War. And so the Constitution as it exists ends up being a framework of argument between anti-slavery forces who say, there isn't property in man, and then pro-slavery forces, including John C. Calhoun being sort of the strongest constitutional advocate of property rights and man, using things like what you're saying, the Fifth Amendment, as an argument for the protection of property and man. So that's a great point. On the question of ratification, this wound up, over time, the Federalists, the supporters of the Constitution, pushed back against all of these demands of various states are saying, let's call another convention, or let's not agree to the Constitution unless there's a Bill of Rights. And they were able to beat back any sort of formal statement by the different conventions that conditioning ratification in that way. But there was not just an implicit promise, but sort of a verbal promise, especially as we get in the back end of the ratification debates, that the first Congress is going to take care of this problem of no Bill of Rights. And Madison, what ends up being very interesting is the Constitution ends up ratified. We don't have a second convention. The Federalists actually win big in that first election. And so, but nevertheless, James Madison still says, we're going to keep our promise. I'm going to both, write and then shepherd through this Bill of Rights. And the first Congress ends up keeping that promise. And so, whereas the Constitution is formally ratified without there being a Bill of Rights, there's really a promissory note for the first Congress that they're going to take care of that deficiency. So great point.
If we could spend an entire day on just dissent, and we could look at the Bill of Rights, we could look at dissent in America, it would be a perfect day to talk about the Bill of Rights and our three lovely dissenters in Signers Hall. But on that note, we are out of time. I said a half hour, but it's been 40 minutes. But Tom, awesome job getting through everything. Thank you guys so much. Great questions in the chat box and the Q&A. You guys kept us moving. And thank you so much. All this will be on our recorded sessions page. We have Neil Gorsuch, Justice Gorsuch tomorrow. So join us for Justice Gorsuch, and Alexis Coe on Friday for our 1 o'clock session. She is one of three female authors who has ever written a book on biography on George Washington. It's going to be a great conversation. We'll talk about the Constitutional Convention, but we'll take a little deeper dive on George Washington and his stories around the Constitutional Convention. So thank you all very much. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time in class.
Thank you, everyone.